When Pericles first advised the Athenians about their prospects in the coming war with Sparta, he cautioned them against certain mistakes, the making of which would prove to be their greatest hindrance to victory. Pericles says this in a speech quoted in Book 1 of Thucydides: "I have many other reasons to hope for a favorable outcome, if you can consent not to combine schemes of fresh conquest with the conduct of the war, and will abstain from willfully involving yourselves in other dangers. Indeed, I am more afraid of our own blunders than of the enemy's devices." But Thucydides writes in Book 2 that the Athenians did not follow his advice. He writes, "What they did was the very contrary, allowing private ambitions and private interests in matters apparently quite foreign to the war to lead them into projects unjust both to themselves and to their allies, projects whose success would only conduce to the honor and advantage of private persons and whose failure entailed certain disaster on the country." When Thucydides says this, the reader knows that the event to which he most refers is the Athenian invasion of Sicily. But there were other campaigns that exposed the flaws in Athenian coordination resulting from the private interests of her commanders. In 429 BC, the Spartans launched an attack on Acarnania, an Athenian ally, in the region on the west coast of Greece, which Thucydides tells us was important for naval access to the Peloponnese. And so the allies of Sparta launched an attack on the region, and Thucydides tells us the Spartans sent round orders for the fleet to equip as quickly as possible and sail to Leucas. So Leucas is this land near the Ambracian Gulf, and Thucydides writes that the Leucadians took the Spartan side and marched with them into Acarnania, except this invasion was unsuccessful. They had to turn around and leave, in part because an Athenian fleet under Phormio had defeated an armada carrying reinforcements. So this was positive for Athens. However, after this victory, a larger enemy fleet of 77 ships was put together and was soon to engage the Athenians with their own 20. And what Thucydides tells us next shows that the Athenians were susceptible to being distracted by enterprises that had nothing to do with defeating Sparta. In the present situation, we have an Athenian fleet outnumbered 77 to 20 by a Peloponnesian fleet under a Spartan admiral. This is what happens. Thucydides writes, "Phormio sent word to Athens of their preparations and his own victory, and desired as many ships as possible to be speedily sent to him, as he stood in daily expectation of battle. 20 were accordingly sent, but instructions were given to their commander to go first to Crete, for a Cretan had persuaded them to sail against Cydonia, promising to procure the reduction of that hostile city. He accordingly went with the ships to Crete, laid waste to the lands of the Sidonians, and what with adverse winds and stress of weather, wasted no little time there." Now, Thucydides tells us that the fleet under Phormio was attacked. He lost. He escaped with 10 of his 20 ships. So we can see the problem. They went against the exact advice of Pericles. And we look at these lines from Thucydides, the adverse winds and the stress of weather that prevented them from sailing, and we can see that he doubts whether or not that's just an excuse that was given. Now, the comic playwright Aristophanes has no problem calling this type of thing out. And in his play Acarnanians, he presents a scene where his main character, Dicæopolis, is lobbying for peace. And so he's frustrated with the Athenian assembly and he's heckling them. He's watching their proceedings and calling out the obvious corruption when he sees it, especially in the appointments of the state. And we get this scene where an ambassador who had been sent out to Thrace has returned, and he makes a similar excuse for his delay that we just read in Thucydides. This guy Theorus says, "We wouldn't have stayed in Thrace so very long," but Dicæopolis interrupts with, "Zeus, no, if you hadn't been drawing hefty pay." And Theorus continues, "If the whole of Thrace hadn't been snowed in." But this Theorus goes on to admit, "All the while I was drinking with Sitalces." we see what Aristophanes would have thought of that excuse about the adverse winds. Not only is he distressed by the fact that so many servants of the state are profiting off the public dole during this state of war and are being paid to make these excursions to these places, but at the destinations themselves, they're richly entertained. This fleet of reinforcements delayed in Crete. I mean, if we look at pictures of Crete, I'd rather go there than go fight a battle against a Peloponnesian fleet too. And a similar failure occurs in this same region out on the west coast of Greece. In 426 BC, Thucydides tells us that the Athenians attacked parts of Leucas, which is the same land where the Peloponnesian fleet had convened to launch that attack on Acarnania. And to help prevent further incursions, the Acarnanians urged Demosthenes, the Athenian general, to build a wall so as to cut off the city from the continent, a measure which they were convinced would secure its capture and rid them once and for all of a most troublesome enemy. But Thucydides continues. Demosthenes, however, had in the meanwhile been persuaded by the Messenians that it was a fine opportunity for him, having so large an army assembled, to attack the Aetolians. Now we can see from the way this is phrased here in the Crawley translation, it was a fine opportunity for him, the Messenians convinced him. They've appealed to his personal ambitions to avoid this measure that his allies are asking him to do. We just saw that the Leucadians marched with the Spartans. They're an open adversary of Athens. Doing something about them would advance the progress of the war effort. Fighting against the Aetolians would be a matter foreign to the war, and that's who they march against. Thucydides continues. To this plan, Demosthenes consented in the belief that by adding the Aetolians to his other mainland allies, he would be able, without aid from home, to march against the Boeotians. So we can see that Demosthenes is looking to expand the holdings of his own personal command, and that he had developed an irrational hope that once one victory is had, the next will be easy. And there was no victory in Aetolia, just a horrible defeat. Thucydides tells us many of the allies were killed, and about 120 Athenian hoplites, not a man less, and all in the prime of life. These were by far the best men in the city of Athens that fell during this war. And in the aftermath, Demosthenes is so embarrassed he can't return to Athens. Precisely this sort of temptation of individual glory, amongst other forms of folly, is warned against in the speech of Diodotus, quoted in Book 3. As long as poverty gives men the courage of necessity, or plenty fills them with the ambition which belongs to insolence and pride, so long will the impulse never be wanting to drive men into danger, hope also, and greed, the one leading and the other following, the one conceiving the attempt, the other suggesting the facility of succeeding, cause the widest ruin. Now, who knows if Demosthenes was actually in Athens to hear those words? But the point is that the warning that is contained in them is proven apt by his folly. He clearly nourished a hope that he could easily beat these Aetolians, win glory by beating them, and then march on the Boeotians and win glory there too. He has a boundless hope, does he not? And as for the greed, Thucydides does tell us that in taking the first 3 cities of the Aetolians, he sent much booty back to Locris. So I don't know if they were rolling in wealth, but it was certainly more lucrative than what the allies wanted, which was for them to build a wall, and certainly more conducive to his own martial glory. And in the instance of this invasion, we see one blunder among many, where the private ambitions of one man were prosecuted at the expense of the common welfare. The Athenians were off to a terrible start in the Peloponnesian War.